been way back. We've actually been off for quite a while, but we started out talking about building a software application, and we went through a whole bunch of different pieces. We talked about design, we've talked about object-oriented, we've talked about proof of concepts and clickable demos and requirements and a whole bunch of stuff like that. I wanted to change gears a little bit and sort of step out of a specific case and look at, in general, putting together an application and thinking about what you're going to do. It's a little bit of design and it's a little bit of project planning and creation. The thing to think about when you're dealing with an application, and whether you're the development manager, whether you're a lead, whether it's something you're doing on your own little side hustle type application, one of the things that to always remember about programming is it's a great quote I found for it. Programming is breaking one big impossible task into several very small possible tasks. Now, if we are doing a simple application like say an address book or something like that, then that's not going to feel like a big impossible task. It's just like, oh yeah, I can do that. It's not that big a deal. I got a couple pages, I maybe got some tables, some data, some moving stuff around. But if you're sitting there thinking about doing an application that is, like maybe a full customer relation management or enterprise resource planning or things like that. These applications, when you first look at them, you're like, oh, that is just huge. And yes, you have a vision of what it's going to look like, but when you peel the layers off of that vision a little bit, it gets very impressive and very intimidating very quick. So, the best way to do that, and this really important when you're talking about estimating, is find a way to take that big thing and break it into something that's a little more manageable. So one of the ways we can do this is we can talk about the components of an application. And when you think about applications, particularly if you've gone past more than one or two that you've built, whether it's a desktop application or web application or mobile application, there are certain things, there are certain components that are going to be part of an application. Every application's got this foundation and minimum requirements that make it an application. These kinds of things are going to set the stage for the front end, the back end, the middle tier, how they work, how you code, how you implement, the user experience, how it's experienced. All of these components combine together. And I'm talking components in a general sense, not like a technical component maybe that you would create or like a control necessarily that you'd make on a user interface. But these are like chunks or pieces of the application. And so in this presentation, what I want to do is talk about some of the common components and think about how you will go about estimating them. The first thing you want to ask yourself is, why does this even matter? Why don't I just go in and slap my requirements into a document and I'm just going to go, it's a checklist. I'm going to start working through my requirements. Well, the nice thing about these is they're very common. So these are going to be things that you are going to be able to essentially learning that you're going to be able to take from one application to the next. Instead of having to reinvent the wheel, you get to pick the wheel up and go plug it into your next application. And in doing so, these are common enough that these are easy to understand. So it's easy to explain to somebody that I need A, B, and C. These pieces I need as part of my application. And if it's a non-technical user, they may say, especially if it's your customer that you're talking to, you're going to be able to say, these are the pieces I need, and they're going to be able to understand what they are because they're common. They may not have thought about them. They may not think about, oh yeah, application has to have that. But once you explain it to them, they're going to be able to understand it. One of the things you can do with this, which is what advancing from a junior to a mid-level into a senior developer, is that you can sort of create a personal repository of either actual source code and examples of these things, or at least like requirements and knowledge about how to do this. So even if you have to do it again, for the 50th time, since you've solved this problem in the past, you've got, sort of off the top of your head, you can start putting together pieces of this. And I'll give some examples here in just a minute. And of course, for all of these things, these actually become perfect targets for reuse because you're doing them over and over and over again. So wherever you can, take that wheel and move it to the next one instead of reinventing it, then you can get some reuse. You can improve quality. You can improve speed to time to market, things like that. And actually for branding as well, because as you're going through this, you're building your own best practice. You're refining this every time probably, because you're going to use it, you're going to test it, you're going to use it again, you're going to test it, you're going to use it again, you're going to test it. And while you're doing this, each of these times, you're going to probably have to customize it a little bit as well. And so what you end up doing is sort of your own personal brand solution for whatever that component happens to be. And what we see here is a good example from a graphical application. There's a whole bunch of different components that you could see, coming out of this. Just looking at it's really a way to get yourself maybe even a starting point. If I'm sitting there and building an application, I'm trying to think of all the pieces that I need. A nice little interface, something like this would maybe be something that would, spark some ideas. For example, like this one, I'm going to be looking at it and saying, I've got to be able to have some sort of a navigation or menuing setup. I'm going to need to have maybe some sort of preferences, it probably is what that top left one is. Maybe I want to have general content, like an about page and maybe privacy policies or contact us or, things like that. Maybe I'm going to have to do something that's going to be some integration out, like in the bottom right. Maybe I've got to do an integration out to like Google Maps or something along those lines. I've got to have some, a couple third-party controls that I'm going to have to build some integrations to. Maybe I'm going to have to do some sort of a report, maybe like that bottom, the bottom middle one there. Maybe there's some sort of reporting and roll-up I've got to do. These are all components that I'm in pieces that I'm going to have to think about and say, okay, these are going to be part of my application. Let's start with the front end. And thinking about the front end, heavily thinking about obviously the user interface, because that's most of it. But this is also just like getting started with the application things. Now, from the user interface point of view, common controls are always going to be useful to you. And these are like I'm talking controls now. So things like buttons and maybe like slider entry controls or drop downs or things like that. If you're dealing with desktop applications, then you may very well have actual controls and components that you build where you've got you've got them hard coded, that you've got an ideal font and size and size of the button and sort of look and feel of it. Does it have that beveled edge, or what's the color of it? Things like that. Because what these are going to do, again, is sort of that branding thing, but also you're going to find some things that just look good. And so maybe what you do is you essentially take the code that actually defines those things and essentially have your own little component, your own little control that you're going to use from app to app. On web applications, it's a little different, but what you'll probably end up, instead of having source code that defines those controls, you may have some style sheets. I've definitely made use of those a lot in the past. You get a couple of good, if you get sort of like your base cascading style sheet or styles and the classes related to them, then it at least gives you a start. So you have an application when you're first starting out, if you're doing wireframes, that you can put something that looks better than just like a straight black and white and very plain vanilla HTML. You can slap some styling on it real quick. And then of course, over time, as you get more complicated things that you want to put together, then you can end up having actually very lengthy or multiple cascading style sheets, source code that you're going to work with. And you just take it from project to project. And if you do it right, it's really easy to flip around some branding by changing around some key colors and things like that. When you're dealing with controls in a desktop sense in particular, you may want to consider base objects for particularly for your form and controls, because what you're going to be able to do, instead of having a button is one thing and it's completely unrelated to a slider control, if you have those things inherit from a core object, then you can do some things like pass around event processing a little better. Maybe there's data that you can pass around a little bit better. These kinds of things. Maybe you want to think about your the components you're putting together before you actually do them. Think about how they're going to interact, and that may allow you to speed up processing again and make it, or the implementation phase, because maybe you can put a lot of that code into one object, inherit, or maybe it's an interface or something like that you utilize it with the other ones. Whoops, and utilize it with those other ones and save yourself having to reinvent essentially recode something over and over and over again. Another thing that you're going to be able to do with this is you'll be able to go through and standardize your look and feel through those colors and fonts. The style sheets, again, that's going to allow you to have some nice little components that you can basically plug into an application right away. Another thing that I've got on the front end is think about messages and notifications, whether it's pop-ups or like a status bar maybe that you put at the bottom of a screen or the top of a screen, status messages maybe that display, where you have messages that show up for say 5 seconds and just sort of fade into the background. Included with that maybe actual text messages or email or something like that you send out. Although, some of those message notifications you may think more in the middle tier of the back end, but nevertheless, those are components. It's more important to consider that that's a component you're going to need, as opposed to necessarily whether it what tier it falls into. Another huge and common component is a login. That's something that you're going to have on almost every application. It is very rare, and we've all got 1,000 different logins and passwords and all that kind of stuff. So you got to think about that as a component. And it's the whole thing. It's not just a login, but what happens if I want to reset a password? What if I've forgotten a password? Do I need to expire passwords? Those kinds of things. It's building that login authentication component. Similar to that, and sort of related to that heavily is security. There's going to be some sort of security, probably. So how do I want to secure stuff? Along with that is really, we'll call it user organization, because it is. Is it a situation where I just have a user and they are what they are, or do I have a user that's part of a company or a division, or are there groups, are there classifications of users? These are all some components that you're going to want to think about and probably be able to implement them from place to place. A common one with users is going to be your standard user and your administrator user. Your administrative side may have different preferences and properties and screens and access. How do you do all of that? Those are going to be components you're going to run into on a regular basis. Another thing related to login is going to be registration, particularly web applications. You're going to need a registration piece probably, because you're going to want users to come in there. They're going to be able to go in and create the account. If they don't, then you're going to have at least somewhere you're going to have some sort of administrative piece probably to create accounts. If it's not a user, if it's not self-service, then you're going to have to go to administrator and allow them to do it. Another thing that you're going to come across that you sort of forget until the end a lot is going to be user help and tutorials. Do you have little help icons out there? Do you need to at some point have a user guide or user manual that you're going to link to or create and include as part of the deployment? Your web applications in particular, but even in desktop applications, there's typically going to be sort of a header, a footer, and some sort of navigation that's going to be part of really every screen. This is your true general look and feel. So you need to think about those things being there. Those are some components that you're going to be putting into estimating your project. On the same line, we sort of mentioned this before, is like micro help or status bars. Maybe you've got a little status bar at the bottom that you're going to be occasionally putting information into. Maybe it's just like a, copyright notice or something like that, but maybe you put some other information there. Maybe there's even some navigation that you're going to put down there, or some, something that they can do more with it than simply view it. Once you've built those kind of components, it's good to carry those along with you. And of course, thinking about those as part of estimating your project. On the front end, we don't think about it very often. We've talked about security, but tracking and auditing sometimes are, an audit trail for the users is sometimes a front end piece. In particular, if you think about some of the tools we've talked about in the past, like Lucky Orange and Crazy Egg and some of those other tools that are out there that are, and even Google Analytics, that are tracking users as they go through an application, you may have to have some sort of a tracking code. And maybe it's just a third party, or maybe you want to do it yourself. Maybe there's something there that you're going to have to think about a component that tracks all the different pages that the users go to, and how long they're there, or some things like that. Log in and log out may be a part of that. Maybe you want to track, have an audit record of everybody that logs in. Maybe you need to track every failed login attempt. Maybe you have to expire deactivate stuff for 30 minutes if they have 5 failures in 30 minutes, stuff like that. Those are all components to consider as you're putting your application together. Deep breath, and now we get to move finally into middle tier. Now, in the middle tier is where your first part where you're going to sort of run into logging. Although there's some audit trails and stuff like that we talked about on the front end, in the middle tier, you're probably going to have some logging. This may be general logging, just so that you've got a way to track flow and how things are going. More likely, you're going to have things like exception and error logs and things like that to help you debug a situation if something breaks. You may also build some translators. This happens a lot, and it's one of those things that you tend to overlook. If you've got some sort of data that's coming in from the front end and has to be put into a different format in the back end, or even from middle tier to middle tier, maybe you've got for example, maybe you've got a customer record that in one section of the middle, that middle tier, you're dealing with them as a customer. But in another case, maybe you're dealing with just their shipping information. And maybe there's some translations or manipulation that you need to do with that. And maybe it's simple things like, conversions and things like that. So maybe you've got a dollar amount that comes in from the front end, and it turns into a minutes of access amount in the back end, and you've got to do some sort of translation or data manipulation there. Those are going to be smaller kind of things where you're not going to think of them as a whole component, but in some cases they do rise to the level of components. Things like pricing calculations, although obviously the pricing rules are going to vary from company to company, just the general structure of a pricing engine is in itself sort of a component that you can go from place to place. Configuration for products when it's not an actual SKU, but it's configurations that don't equate to different SKU numbers. So what often could be like maybe colors, possibly even sizes and some things like that. Having that kind of configurator piece could be a component you may run into. A lot of times you're going to have helper classes and logic controls. They're going to be able to allow you to quickly provide like that underlying set of activities that your application is going to need. A good example of that is logging. So maybe you've got a couple of functions that are setting up a log file, writing out to a log file, archiving a log file, rolling over to a new log file. And yes, you may have like a log4j or something like that does it for you, but maybe you've got your own that you have to do for whatever that component has to be. And so you'll find some of those helper classes that you're going to want to take from project to project. You may have some third-party stuff. There's some open source tools out there, but nevertheless, you can make them your own in a sense and say, okay, this is something I always want to make sure I include. And maybe there's a few minutes of setup and configuration to do it from project to project. I think a lot of people have gone away from this, but base or root objects are something I used a lot years ago, and I've gotten away from them. I know I haven't seen it very often, but they can be very powerful, particularly in the middle tier when you more or less are building stuff from scratch. I mean, you don't have the front end, you've got like a screen or a control or something like that is sort of already your base object, and you may or may not have access to it. In the middle tier, that's not the case. A lot of times you're basically writing from scratch. So you've got, for example, all of these containers that you're dealing with that have got some data in them, your data model objects basically. And they can all just extend an object, just a plain old object, or they can all come from a developer-based object class, that has maybe it's got an ID and a couple of pieces that are easy ways to grab that object and wheel and deal with that object based on the ID. Maybe it's got things like, simple things that you would use a lot, but convert the object to string, a toString function that takes all of its properties and prints them out to a string. Things like that you end up a lot of times finding that, I need to write this on this object and I got to do this on an object. And particularly if you do fat objects, if it's just pure data, okay, that's pretty simple. It's just going to be, it's attributes and getters and setters, if that. But once you get into some of the, things beyond that, like saving, things that are helper functions and work with those data objects, then you may want to have some nice base controls and allow you to, if nothing else, wheel and deal with objects a little bit better. And it is very useful when you get into some of the functions and things that you may want to do with data manipulation, because if you can treat every model as essentially the same thing in some cases, it allows you to go through and not have to redo code over and over again. Particularly if you can do some like reflection and some of the things that some languages allow you to do, and some of the dynamic languages where you can actually go in and you can do actually some really cool stuff and have it all sitting in, maybe it is a fat root object, but in that case, maybe just make it a helper so you don't have to have instances of it all over the place. As I mentioned before, there is often in the middle tier, you're going to have like all these little small functions, things like that I'm running into a lot. And I've got scripts that I, basically like utility classes that I take from project to project. It'll be things like a function that will take a number and put preceding zeros out to a certain length. So, the number 1, if I want it to be a 6-digit number, it's going to be 0000001. And maybe I've got, some little function that does that, or something that prefixes spaces or puts it, appends spaces or some number or some letter. Maybe I want to put an X to at the beginning of a string just to make it a certain length. So I wanted a 10, I want a name field, I want it to always be 10, and I'm just going to put like X's at the front of it just because that's part of what I do. Particularly if you're using like fixed length output, report formatting, things like that. You're gonna have these little functions and conversions that you're going to want to deal with on a regular basis. Date stuff, depending on what your language is, sometimes you've got date conversion things there that work really well. Sometimes not. Maybe you've got a couple of things you do that are you see it from project to project and they're not actually part of the language. So put those things together. Don't be afraid to have sort of a catch-all component that you use from place to place. And if not, at least as part of estimating the project and thinking about it beforehand and putting requirements together, think about those kind of things. It's good to know that, because I've got, because I'm a financial application, I'm going to have to deal with making sure that I've got the right monetary symbol there. And I'm going to have to make sure that I, take care of decimals properly to the right so that it's always going to be, I've got to have something that's going to make sure it cuts it off and treats it as a monetary format. Things like that. It doesn't hurt to have your own personal function repository. Along the way, consistent signatures of functions and methods and things like that you're going to get as part of having this components. I mean, this is going to be huge because then you're more likely to have stuff look like one developer did it instead of 50 developers did it. And it's going to be easier to document, it's easier to maintain, it's easier for you because then you don't have to sit there and go, shoot, was that the first parameter or the second parameter or the third parameter? And IDEs are really good because they use code insight and things like that allow us to quickly see that now, but not everybody has that. And if you, for some reason, have to jump into some source code in VI, then it's going to be a pain. You're going to have to go look up that signature and make sure you get stuff in the right order. So, those kinds of things, if you think about these components and you use them from project to project, then you're more likely to be consistent with them. You have your own little coding standards that you can work with. And if you go somewhere where their coding standards are a little different, so be it. You can go ahead and you can make those adjustments as needed. In the middle tier, you're also going to definitely have, just like the front end, you've got security, you've got authentication and encryption that encryption is a little different. you've got all those pieces in the front end. You're definitely going to have those in the middle tier as well, that you're going to have to be able to probably, be concerned with, is this an authorized user of whatever this data is? And that can be in itself a little bit of a trick, is making sure that the right user, checking user IDs and ownership of data within the middle tier. We'll also see this in the back end, getting used to having those kind of components there. You'll see it often enough. It doesn't hurt to have those things built out and be comfortable with them. Along the same lines, it's going to be user data and sessions, being able to make sure that you, if you have a stateful application, is being able to actually maintain those states, particularly if you've got something that's in a disconnected way, to be able to reconnect. So, if somebody comes in from a web application, they set up a session, having the things that manipulate session IDs so that you can track them when they come back again, later. If they've come in through a web application, then you're sitting in the middle tier, you may not know who they are. So maybe they've got you've got that extra infrastructure of having some sort of a session ID that comes in that you can validate that, oh, okay, this person is actually now tied to this instance, and I can go off and do what I need to with them. Deep breath again, and we dive into the back end. Back end components are probably as wide and varied as anything that's out there. And there are also things that I think we overlook quite a bit. The first one is store procedures. They're not, depending on where you're at, they're not as common, I think, as they could be. And you can put together store procedures that can allow you to do a lot of manipulation of common structures that you could just keep it as some queries, but maybe you've got some store procedures that you create as well to get even a little bit deeper. And by this, the common structures I'm thinking about are things like addresses and phone numbers and customer records and line items and invoices and things like that you see over and over and over again, orders, all of this stuff that you're going to see it depending on what line of business you're in. So if you're in healthcare, you're going to see patient records and doctors and ICD-9 numbers and things like that, and insurance companies and payers and payees and all that kind of stuff that's healthcare. Well, if you're in finance, then you're going to be seeing customer records and general ledger records and account payables and receivables and things like that. And they have their structures. If you're in commerce, in e-commerce, like I said, you're going to have customers, you're going to have orders, you're going to have fulfillment. These kinds of records that you see over and over and over again, there's going to be the same kind of actions and work that are going to need to be taken on them. So although these may just be simple SQL scripts that you're using that you're going to reuse over and over again because they're roughly the same structure, save a couple, you're going to change maybe a couple of column names, but other than that, you're ready to go. Maybe you have full-blown procedures that do some of this stuff, which is going to make sense when you think of, especially like order processing and things like that, where you're not really doing like a bulk update of a table or two. You're going in and you're going to have to, like grab a record out of one and start cycling through it and then go do update multiple other records. Those kinds of things can be some great components that you can build. And yeah, they're not going to be exactly the same from project to project, but at least it gives you a start. You can, like I said, maybe it's just a matter of changing a couple table names and a couple of column names, and you're pretty much off and running. Cron jobs and scripts, which really combines with like backup compression and encryption. There's a lot of stuff on the back end that you do over and over and over again. You do deployment scripts, you're going to do backup stuff, you're going to be backing up to certain areas, you're going to archive your backups, you maybe have to clean some of your old backups up. You're probably going to want to compress some of the data that's out there, or again, roll that off into some sort of archival format. Maybe with that, you're going to have to do some encryption of it. All of these scripts just are going to be almost the same from place to place. You're going to change some folder names. Maybe you change the number of files that you're dealing with or the types of files you're dealing with. But once you've got that basic component together, you can take it from project to project, and it gives you a good way to estimate stuff because you know that, okay, it took me half a day to do this last time. It's going to take me half a day probably to do this next time, or maybe a little less than that because I learned something the first time through. With scripts, there's also build scripts. And this is going to be, compiling source, moving source around, pulling source out of version control, updating version control, copying files out to certain areas, running data update scripts on a database, those kinds of things. You consider that's always going to be a part of any project. So, make sure that you've accounted for that. Data scramblers is something I've run into a couple of places, and they tend to be very useful, particularly depending on certain clients. If you're in healthcare or anywhere where you've got highly sensitive data, what we run into a lot in those kind of situations is that you've got like a development or a test environment, and you're trying to simulate the production environment, but you just don't have the same amount of data that production's working with. Your little test or local development environment, you may only have hundreds of records, but you're trying to track stuff down and do debugging on a production database that's got millions or tens of millions of records. And the reason that you can't just basically work on a copy of the production database is because you don't want to have that data. You don't want to have maybe credit card numbers or phone numbers or user email addresses and things like that on your local drive. You don't want to accidentally trigger an email out to a customer. You also don't want to have their data available. So if you somehow get hacked, you don't want that somebody's able to actually get useful data that should have been all protected on that production machine. Well, data scramblers are a great way to do that. And sometimes that's something you want to, build into your effort. And these may be as simple, your scrambler may be as simple as like blanking out stuff. Maybe you're going to all it's going to do is it's going to go through and it's going to say, I want to take every phone number in the application and just turn it to an empty string or a set string. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to turn every phone number into 555, 555, 5555, or something like that. Email addresses, a lot of times I've set it up. You can scramble them, and sometimes you have to because email address is used as a unique identifier in some cases. Sometimes it's not. It's just used to communicate information. So what you can do is you can just go in and just like assign every field your email address. That's it's a nice and easy way to sweep through stuff. When you get into some things that are more complicated, like names and addresses, like physical addresses, order numbers, things like that, order amounts, those you may have to get a little bit more complicated in your scrambler. You may have to actually have it like I know one case we went through, and to randomly do names, what we did is we had a script that went through, and for every first and last name field in the database, it just randomly picked from a list of like 10 names, 10 first names and 10 last names, just randomly picked a couple items from that and plopped it in so that you could look at stuff, and it randomly, sometimes you can scramble addresses. You may go through and give it a whole bunch of different random street names and numbers and things like that. Same thing. So what you end up having is a development database that you're looking at that has the amount and distinct data similar to what production has. May not be exact, but it's close enough, and you've lost all of the identifiable information at this point. So if somebody looks at the database, good luck finding anything useful. It's the names have been protected. None of these names should reflect anything in the real world because you've completely randomly scrambled your data. Great tool to throw in there occasionally, and if you're out there and estimating a project, one of those things that's a component that could be a big one, so you want to make sure you think about that. Of course, on the back end, there's also logging and exception handling, much like you've got in the middle tier, but it's probably going to be a slightly different component and a different approach. So you want to make sure that you think about that as a separate piece, just like the front end may be a separate piece. You're always going to have some sort of component related to data security and protection on the back end. I mean, even if it's the most simple thing, there's some most simple applications these days, you're going to have some component there that you're going to have to deal with. Logging and help for debugging, you're probably going to need some sort of component there. We've talked about just a second ago, talked about like doing logging and exception handling, but you're probably going to have like have a couple components that allow you to actually dig through those logs, or maybe some tools that you're going to utilize that will allow you to dig through those logs and more quickly get to whatever it is you're trying to debug. Different from application logging is, of course, your access and audit trails. This is a situation where it's not really about the data, it's about the users, it's about the accessing of the data. So you've got a completely different log there, and probably some different logging tools and summary tools and things like that you're going to have to build. We talked about your build and deploy scripts. These are there are the application level ones, but there's also the ones that are database. So you may have to do stuff that's like going to drop your database and recreate it from scratch. I highly recommend that you always have that as part of your application and keep them up to date, so that at some point, if you need to start from scratch, you have the ability to do so. If you want to build an empty development machine somewhere, you have the ability to do that. And maybe with that, you've got some import scripts as well that allow you to bring in some seed data to essentially give a developer a development environment where they can just come in, say, hey, run these scripts, boom, you're going to have everything going. You're going to have a little bit of data. You're going to have this test user or two, and they can get going, and they don't have to worry about it taking up, maybe gigabytes of their machine. They don't have to worry about copying huge amounts of stuff down from servers and things like that can really take a lot of time. Lastly, on the back end, you're also going to have, much like you did on the middle tier, you're going to have data manipulation and migration kind of stuff that's going on. These are probably going to be more likely like SQL scripts if you're dealing with a database, but they also may be like awk and sed scripts if you're dealing with files or configurations and things like that, and even potentially like log files and access or audit trails. Or if you're dealing like finance, sometimes you're going to, like ACH transactions and stuff like that. What you end up doing is you're essentially writing a file out in some fixed format, or HL7 if you're in the healthcare world, maybe you're writing some files out like that. So there's going to be some potentially some data manipulation and migration steps that you're going to have to do, and components are going to be sitting on the back end. So we've gone through all of this, and you can use this as a laundry list of stuff, but there's gaps. I'm sure there are things that I've missed, and particularly for yourself, this is based on my experience, and your experience is going to be a little bit different. So when you're looking for, when you're putting together a project plan, when you're estimating, when you're trying to figure out what you need to do to get the job done, for whatever your project happens to be, one of the first things to do is look at past applications. Look at some of the things you've done in the past, particularly if they are very, at least a little bit or very similar to the application you're doing. And don't be afraid to look at completely different applications, because what you're going to do as you're looking across, multiple very different applications, you're still going to see these things, these components that exist in every one of them. Like a login. No matter what your application is, you're probably going to have a login, because you're going to have some sort of user, because it's going to be saving some user data. So that's right there. There's a login that's going to show everywhere. There's going to be some sort of user record that's going to show up everywhere. Along with that, there's probably going to be some sort of preferences or configuration. So take a look at those, and if you haven't accounted for those, for those components, then make sure you do. When you're building a new application, you're going into something that maybe you're not as comfortable with, or maybe it is something that's an industry where there's a lot of advances being made. Don't be afraid to look at competitor sites and applications. You're going to find stuff that you say, wow, that's a component I really need. Didn't think about it. For example, online help. A lot of sites now have these little, robo chat kind of things. These, they're bots that are able to do some basic customer support. Like maybe product queries, service queries, connect them to like a support desk. Things like that. Maybe you don't think about that as a component, but you start looking at some of the competitor sites and you say, you know what, that's something I need to have. So make sure that component is part of your project and your project plan. As you're going through, we've talked in the past about clickable demos and things like that. And what you'll find out is that wireframes and walkthroughs that you do early on are going to help you highlight some of the gaps and some of the needed components if you do them correctly, or we'll say thoroughly. What you end up doing is you sort of tell a story. If you do it right, you're going to end up essentially telling a story through your wireframe and your walkthrough. And you're going to, at some point, there's probably going to be some gaps there. So, for example, the user account and login is pretty easy. So is a commonly known thing. So if you're sitting there and your wireframe is, here's the home page. This is what the user sees first. Well, that would beg the question, okay, how did the user get there? What does the user do? Do they just go to an address and they just see this? Did they log in? How do we know who the user is? They may or may not. That may or may not be a part of it. If you're just a product catalog, then maybe you don't have a user. Maybe they just jump in and the first thing they see is a catalog. That's okay. But when they get to the point of checking out, you're going to say, well, how did they check out? How do I know who they are? How do they have their information? Do they save that information? If so, does that mean we register them? Do we want them to register at another point? That's where these components will be brought out as part of doing your walkthroughs. These are some of the things you're going to get as part of doing your due diligence and getting your requirements built. When in doubt, again, this as part of this research, look for commercial applications where possible. Find, even if you're doing something for you're somebody at your church or somebody down the street or your neighbor or friend or just a little side hustle thing where you don't think it rises to the level of a commercial application, that's okay. Take a look at some that are out there. People that have put big amounts of money into a solution similar to, in some way to what you're doing. You maybe find some good components there that's just wow, I really should put that in there. Some of them aren't going to be that big. They're going to be things you're going to look at. You say, I could probably put that together in a few hours, and it's going to really up the value of my solution. So don't be afraid. Theft is theft of thought and controls is perfectly possible, unless there's some sort of copyright law or something like that you run into with it, or patented materials like Amazon's one-step checkout, some of those kind of things. Okay, yeah, you may run into it, but generally speaking, you're gonna be able to find a lot of components out there that are pieces of an application that you want to make sure that those will help jog your memory or jog your requirements gathering, we'll say, and she'll say, oh yeah, that's right, that's another piece that I'm going to make sure I take into account. As you go through all of this, put together your plan, sort of, you've got your components, take a look at your component list, look at whatever you've got as far as requirements or wireframes or, clickable demos, things like that. Look at all of those things, look at your component list, review the two, build out your component list, and then repeat, walk through it again. Just basically do it a couple times through, because each time you do it, you probably will find a gap or two. There's something that you forgot. As you do this, you're going to get better over time. The more projects you do, the more times you've put together your core components, the better you're going to get. You're going to have in your head or maybe on paper or somewhere else, this sort of template list of components. These are things that I always do. I always do A and B and C and D. So the next time you put a project together, you're going to say, I got to do A, B, C, and D. And if you've got a customer that's putting something together, you can ask them, have you thought about A? Have you thought about B? Have you thought about C? Have you thought about D? And now you're adding a lot of value to future projects you put together, because you've got all of these components and pieces that are in your mind that are part of your default approach to building software. So some of the final thoughts on this. The better you understand the components that are in your head or on the sheet of paper, and how they interact, how they integrate, and what it takes to build them, what are the core questions that need to be asked to make sure that you build them in a way that is, solves the problem your customer needs, the closer your estimates are going to be. As you're estimating your project, they're going to get better, because you're going to understand more detail what needs to be done, you're going to, of course, do this over and over and over again. And so you're going to get better at understanding how to get it done, and it's going to be more reproducible. The components are also going to be, if you ever do commercial software, whether it's software as a service or platform as a service or a desktop application or mobile application, anything like that, these are all components that are the ones you're using. Yes, you may throw them out from time to time, but probably in commercial software, all of the above are going to have to be a part of it. So if you ever fall into a situation where you're now going to take a project and turn it into a product and try to go sell it, you're going to want to have these components, already considered. At least, maybe you left a hook for it to be created later and didn't actually include it, but at least it's there. These are also going to be, these are really best practices. These are the things, like I said, pretty much every application is going to have a login, because that's just what people expect these days. Security, logging, audit, all that kind of stuff. These are going to show up, and these are going to be expected for applications that are well done or professionally done. As a professional software developer, these are kinds of things that are essentially going to be expected of you. And honestly, in a lot of cases, you're going to expect to already know this. Once you're beyond your first few years, you're going to be in situations where you're going to say, okay, we want to build this application. What is what's involved in that? And these sort of components and pieces are going to be the things that you're going to say, well, we need to do this, and we need to do this, and we need to do this other thing. And all of those things you just listed may have nothing to do with the requirements that they've put forth. But you're just saying, hey, to build an application, this is the minimum kind of stuff. These are the pieces that have to be there to build an application. That being said, I'm going to open up now for questions, suggestions, thoughts. Anybody want to throw some feedback into this? What are some of the things you've run into? And of course, do you have any questions about any things that I've covered?
Yeah, I was wondering concerning the collection of user data, just using that user data. I know that Facebook, Zuckerberg was before Congress, a few weeks ago. And just wondering how, we should responsibly collect user data, but then what's the decision you have to face when you want to collect all this data, specifically because we're in the information age and we want to market this data. Obviously marketers and advertisers want to know about how people are using whatever, so just want to know what your thoughts are on that.
I'm probably not a popular person in the modern world right now with the whole Facebook thing, because I don't think there was anything wrong whatsoever with what they did. Facebook's business model is, we're going to give you a whole bunch of free crap, but you're going to give us data and we're going to sell it to anybody we want to. I mean, that is the business model. There's a buddy of mine that's a marketing guy that he says, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And that really is, that's what you need to know. Whether all these tools that we use that are free and these sites that are free, they're not free. Right. We are paying for them by doing something, probably by providing information. And if you look at these places, and Facebook's one of them, they say, we're tracking your data. We will sell your data. It's that if you dig into this stuff, they've said that. So there was nothing at all wrong about what they did. I know people may have said afterwards, oh my gosh, they gave this stuff, but they freely did it. It's not, it's a customer relation kind of thing. It's a political thing. It's making sure that you are clear in what you're doing. And if people, if people say, yeah, whatever, and they come back and they say, I can't believe you did that. You just say, look, to me, it's just like, look, this is what you signed. This is what we told you. And if you didn't like it, you could have stopped at any time, but you didn't. So don't go in there and get a whole bunch of free stuff and then come back later and say, oh, wait, I don't like the fact that I'm getting all of these emails. It's like, well, sorry, that was the price you pay. And that's what we need to do. I mean, you need to protect the validity of data and protect the data as far as whatever your privacy policies are.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need to make sure, and sometimes it is as simple as, we're going to collect your data, but we're never going to actually send it out with you being personally tied to it. We're going to aggregate data. We're going to separate it from users. We're going to, genericize it and turn it into statistics and sell that to people instead of it being, like Timothy's information. That's where it's going to vary from project to project, but it is a component. It's a question you need to ask, and it's a component that needs to be a piece of every application is, what are we actually doing with this data? What are we doing to secure it? What are we doing to protect it? And also, if we're selling it, what are we doing to make this sellable? And there's been applications projects I've worked on where that's part of it. We want to make sure we're gathering and validating the data, certain data, because we're going to turn around and sell it. And we want to make sure that when we sell it, that we are selling them precise data. A good example is an application I worked on where you would go in, it's a website, and you'd go in and you were looking for a car, and part of what you do is you'd be entering enough information that it's going to turn around, and it told you, do you need a car loan? Yeah. Well, we're going to ask you some questions, and we want to make sure that we've got the right data, because we're going to turn around and take that, and we're going to basically try to sell it to a bunch of different loan companies. And we want them to have as much information as possible, as correct in information as possible, so that if we sell them a lead, that they have the right phone number for you, or the email, or however it is that they contact you to say, hey, you were checking this thing out the other day. You said you were in the, Timothy, I know you're looking for a Porsche, and here's the price range, and here's the information you gave us. I want to verify that, but make sure that you told us you're making X amount of money a year, that you were looking for this amount of monthly payments, and those kinds of things. You want to validate your data as well. So validation, although I never really talked about it, that's often going to be a component as well. That answer your question in a long enough way?
I'd like to add one thing to that, though, Rob, and it still boils down to your disclaimer. Basically, if you tell the user you're going to do X with the data, you better do X. In the case of Facebook, they essentially ignored some of their privacy settings that were in their application. So some of their user data that went out was basically ignoring what people were saying, hey, don't share this information. It was shared anyway. And that's why they got in trouble more so than the fact that they were just collecting the information.
Well, it had to do with, they changed their policies. If you go back to the policies at the time, because I was working in the Facebook API at the time, and when they changed that, because they had everything wide open, and nobody really thought about it, but it was obvious to anybody that looked at their Facebook account, and they changed stuff. And that's actually in itself a little bit of that's an interesting challenge, because if you change your practices and you go from, we're wide open and we're selling everything to everybody, to, okay, we don't really want to do that. And Facebook did it because they had some pressure, because people were finding out that they had all this data that they really didn't want out there. And so Facebook had to change their policies and their preferences and their ability to lock down data. But all of the data before that, the horse was out of the barn. And so if you're in a situation like that where you're changing what you do, we're getting away from components here, but that is something that you have to make sure that you communicate that very well. And you're probably going to end up in a situation where you're basically almost like a data breach, where you'd essentially have to tell your users, okay, look, you're locking this stuff down, but before you locked it down, here's the people that had access to your data, something like that. That becomes in itself, and again, it has to do with, customer relations and some of the other things, but it is a really interesting challenge in itself. And it's something where, as a user, you just have to think about it as things usually they will become tighter as time goes on because people complain about people having access to their stuff. But early on, if you're an early adopter, your data is probably all over the place and out there. One, because people probably aren't protecting it enough, and two, because early on they're going to say, "Hey, we're going to allow to sell anything anywhere because that's how we make our money." And in particular these days, with like advertising and things like that, there's a whole lot of data people are going to be capturing because they want to be helpful to their advertisers. Because at the end of the day, the advertisers are the ones that pay the bills. It's not you as a user; it's the advertisers. So they're going to help them out. So yeah, we've gotten a little bit off track on the component thing, but definitely there are components that you're going to build to do these pieces. A granularity, as Michael sort of mentioned or alluded to, is that having a granularity of how data is shared, being able to essentially as a user turn on and off access to pieces of your data to different people. The idea of like in Facebook, of friends versus friends of friends versus completely public versus only certain people, and things like that. Having those levels of granularity and levels of access in those access controls, again, in itself is going to be sort of a component that you would build over time and something that you would take from project to project.
I see. It's really good. I'm gonna have to listen to the recording of all that, but that's very good.
Other questions, comments? Suggestions of components maybe that you run into on a regular basis that we haven't touched on?
Go ahead, David.
No, okay. I was going to ask you, like, usually when they're building these applications, do they normally begin on the front end? Usually, like, okay, let's begin at the front end, and then they continue from there before they go to the middle tier and the back end?
No, it can be all over the place. Sometimes people do. But sometimes there's like test-driven development where they basically start from the requirements and start building out things that support the requirements. It may be done in parallel. So it may be that there's people working on the back end while some other people are doing stuff in the middle tier and other people doing it on the front end. It varies from project to project. I don't know that I don't think there's like a universally right way to do it. There's probably a right way to do it for each project. There's a certain way that it helps to flow the creation of these pieces in the implementation phase, but it can be done so many different ways. And again, it depends. If it's a team of like one or two people, then it's probably going to be very much a serial process because they're only going to be able to work on so much at a time. If you're a team of 1,000 developers, then they're probably going to be working on all different pieces because they have the ability to do so.
So the middle tier is kind of where security and networking, whatever, falls into that tier?
Honestly, it's actually, although there is, you have to be able to be cognizant of work with security in the middle tier. Actually, security usually lives in the front and the back because those are the access points. You can get to as a user, you get to the application from the front end. As a hacker or something like that, you really want to get in at the back end because that's where all the data lives. So those are the two pieces where security is most likely to live. Although it may in the middle tier if things are passed around, if it's like a service-oriented architecture or if you're using APIs or things like that, there may be some security and some encryption there as well. But typically, when you're in the middle tier, you're sort of in a self-contained area, and it's you're really worried more about the access points getting into and out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I'd like to add one thing to the components piece, though. So as you're building components, if you use a lot of third-party APIs, if you don't keep up with those over time, you might end up in a case where you have a component that is useful now, but if you try to reuse it later, it may never be useful. Like the third-party APIs may go away. You may have to pay for licensing. So you got to be careful with any dependencies you include or open source that you use with some of your components.
That's an excellent point. And that's not even, that's even if it's just without keeping up with the changes, because there's licensing issues and things like that could cause whatever your normal way to do stuff. It may not be valid. It may not be viable. It may not be valid in a certain environment. Open source in particular, there's some companies that refuse to have open source. They want to make sure that everything is strictly licensed, and what they've already licensed and 100% by the book. They don't want any potential issues. And maybe it's because they're commercial, so some of the open source licenses don't apply to them. But sometimes they only want the GNU public license is the only kind of source that they'll do, or the open source or Creative Commons, or some of these other licenses that are out there that the only ones they'll work with. So excellent point. If you utilize third-party stuff, be very you want to make sure you understand what the implications are of that if you bring it into a product anywhere, even your own, because there may be something there where you think it's licensed, but it's not really. And I have run into several places where people worked at a company that had licensed a library or a tool, and then they go somewhere else, or they go do it for themselves. And it's fine for a while because they're still licensed because they're an employee of that company, but suddenly their employment situation changes, and now they technically don't have a license anymore, which means the Software Piracy Association could come after them and whack them for a license fee, or some sort of penalties for having stuff that's not licensed. Excellent point. Any other questions, comments, suggestions? Hearing nothing but crickets, then, all right. Through all of this, let's think about what we learned here. What should we be walking away with this? The important thing that I really wanted to get across that we should be walking away is that there are these components or these facets of every application. They're going to need them. We want to think about them. We want to make sure that we're including them when we're doing our estimates. We want to make sure we include them as part of requirements of building the application. We don't want to get to the end and find out, crud, I completely forgot about this piece. I got to go back and build it. As you're doing this, you want to make, I think it's easiest if you're thinking about the front, the middle, and the back end, or the data tiers, because there's components become very obvious in each of those areas, and that's going to help you make sure that they don't fall through the cracks. And of course, with all these, you want to be able to reuse them where possible to speed your development. The first time or two you do a product or create software, it's going to be new to you, so you're going to have to learn it. But after that, once you build your second, your third, your fourth, and your fifth, and so on, you should be able to look back at prior things and find situations where you essentially had to solve the same problem. You can take that. Maybe not exactly, because maybe you solved it in Java and now you're in C#, but at least you can look at some of the steps you took, and it's going to allow you to get that done a little bit faster the next time through. So this is going to allow you to improve quality, because every time you do it, you've gone through a cycle, you've fixed stuff, you've tested stuff, you've found stuff, you've customized stuff, and it's just going to get better. So it's going to be higher quality. You're obviously going to be able to develop faster because you're going to be able to take things that you've done in the past and quickly recode them or just copy the code in. And of course, it's going to be, overall, you're going to have a more professional looking product when you're done, because you're going to have all of these pieces that people don't, if you asked them, they wouldn't be able to list out that these are components of software. But if it's not there, they're going to know it. As always, thank you for your time. Always appreciate having the feedback that we have as part of this. If there's anything that you think about later, always open to discussing it wherever possible. So you can send questions, comments, and suggestions to us through the email at info@developerpreneur.com. You can hit us up on the contact form. You can follow us on Twitter at Developerpreneur. Check us out on our Facebook page. Listen to the podcast. And any other way, I think we'll be working on smoke signals sometime soon as well, just to make it as easy as possible to get a hold of us. As always, goal is just to make every developer better, including ourselves. So the more feedback we get, the more that we're not only going to be able to help you, but also help ourselves.